Good morning. Today we're going to do a little lesson on perspective. So let's get started. Open up your sketchbook to a nice clean page and then rotate your sketchbook so that it is in landscape style. Now to begin with, we're just going to draw some boulders. Boulders are rocks of various sizes, and we're going to draw about 6 of them. Make sure that your boulders are different sizes and different locations on your sketchbook page. So this one's going to be kind of like here. Maybe this is a small one. Maybe this is like this. Maybe there's one here. And for right now, don't let them overlap. Don't do any shading. And just give me the outline of these boulders. Now, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So there's 6 boulders, and it's pretty interesting, but it's hard to tell which boulders are further away and which boulders are closer, because boulders come in different sizes, and one that's in the far distance might look smaller, but it's actually bigger than all of the others. So we're going to use some fun tricks in order to help the person that's looking at these boulders understand their relationship to each other and their size, and that's called perspective. So the first thing that we're going to do is to put in a horizon line. We're going to use our ruler. It's important to know that the horizon line is perfectly horizontal. That's actually the relationship of horizon line and horizontal, the words themselves. You don't want it to be angled. It is where the earth meets the sky. And we can position it so that our boulder that's highest up on our paper is peeking out above the horizon line, and then the bottom part of the boulder is below the horizon line. Make that nice and straight, just like that. Already, it's starting to become more obvious that this, as the horizon line is laying down the ground area. We're going to go ahead and label horizon line. Now we're going to add in a few more boulders, and we're going to underlap them. So if there's this boulder, if there's another boulder that's behind it, closer to the horizon line, it's going to be drawn on our paper as if it's a little higher than the boulder that we're looking at, closer to the horizon line. And then that's going to look like it's stacked behind that boulder. Maybe there's another one that is behind this boulder, and maybe it looks like that. So overlapping objects really is a nice way of creating this sense of perspective. Maybe there's a little one that's under here someplace. And then maybe we have another one. Again, make sure that you put it above the boulder that's already there. And you can add more boulders. Maybe there's even one that's coming off of our page. So it's starting to look like maybe like a beach with these boulders that are kind of sprinkled throughout. So up here, I'd like for you to write a couple little notes to yourself. Overlap creates a sense of space. That's one thing to keep in mind. Another is that objects appear smaller in the distance. So with this in mind, we're going to make, this is a nice big boulder. We're going to make one more big boulder if you have room for it. And it's so big that you just don't even see all of it because it's off of the page. And then we're going to make some smaller boulders in the far, far distance. And we can still underlap, so you could put 2 or 3 together. So that it's starting to kind of lay everything down. Okay, so there's another trick that we can do. We can use our thin and thick Sharpies in order to outline our boulders, with the thicker pen being outlining objects closer to the viewer and the thinner pen being used for objects further from the viewer. So we're going to start with the thick pen, and we're going to, I'm even like laying it on its side so that it's nice and thick. I might even go over that a couple of times, making my kind of jiggity jag. This is a natural rock, so it's a little irregular. And again, I'm laying it on its side so that it's a nice thick line. These 2 huge boulders that are right up near the viewer. Ooh, I'm really gonna thicken this up. I like that so much. I'm gonna make it really thick up here toward the front, toward my viewer. And then as the boulders go back, I'm going to, and also I tend to do a thinner line when they hit the ground, a thicker line when they're up in the air. What that does is it helps you feel like there's more space behind that boulder. So the few boulders that I have that are close to the viewer are getting the thick lines. And then as the boulders are closer to the horizon line, further away from the viewer, then they're going to get thinner lines. And you might need to, maybe that's a little bit too thin, so maybe I use my Sharpie, but I use just the thick Sharpie, but I use just the tip of it. Maybe even this one has the tip of the thick Sharpie. Okay, and then maybe the ones that are in the distance just have the thin Sharpie. Sometimes I like to go over it just a second time. But what this does is it emphasizes the stones or the boulders that are closer to the viewer, and it de-emphasizes the ones that are further away, and helps to create that sense of three-dimensionality and perspective, which all gives us a sense of space. And let's go ahead and I'm going to use my ruler. You don't have to, but you can. Lay it down and ink that horizon line. Just like that. Okay, so they're starting to get more interesting, starting to look like they're laying down. Now I'm going to do another thing. This is another neat trick. So you can write this up here. Objects in the foreground. Show more detail. So this is the foreground, this is the middle ground, and then this is the background, right? This is the background, foreground, middle ground, background. So the background has the horizon line, the sky, maybe it has some clouds up there, things like that. The foreground are the boulders that we can see that are closest to us, and they might have some interesting details. We might not see those interesting details when the boulders are so far away, because details tend to kind of disappear the further away they are. This is called atmospheric perspective. So the details up here in these, I'm just gonna give myself some squiggly loose lines. These are just, maybe they're like little rivulets, little texture that's in the boulders. Maybe it goes someplace, something like this. It's just giving those a little bit of detail. Really messy. It's not really realism. It's just kind of adding a little bit of texture. And then as the stones go back, as the boulders go back, then we see less and less of them. We can also use shading to create a sense of perspective and have these stones lay down. So objects in the foreground show more detail. And let's see. And then let's go ahead and write down what atmospheric perspective makes objects in the distance lighter and cooler. When I say cooler, I'm talking about cooler colors rather than warmer colors. So objects back here will tend to look a little bit bluer, whereas objects that are up close will look a little less blue. If you've ever been to the mountains, then you've probably seen examples of that. We're not coloring with colors today, but we have our 4B or our 6B pencil, and we can do a little bit of shading. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have higher contrast, more shading in our boulders that are closer to us, and then the ones that are further away are going to be a little bit flatter. So if the sun's coming down from this angle, then these boulders, we can go ahead and I'm just going to be kind of messy here. I'm just doing a real quick, this is not like a fancy project. It's just going to give us a little starting point for perspective. So I'm using the side of my pencil, and I'm just sketching in some kind of like really loose, messy values along the bottom and the left-hand side, as if my sun was up here, and creating shade or shadow on the bottom left of my boulders. And I'm working on my middle, my mid-ground, my middle ground boulders first. And just, so it has middle ground and foreground have higher contrast, more detail, and a stronger outline. Okay, and I purposefully adjusted the pressure of my shading so that the top of the boulder is lighter, and then the bottom and the left-hand side is darker. That was intentional. That's so that you have a sense of this light source of being up here in the sky, creating a sense of light. So really light shading up here on top, and just lots of pressure down at the bottom. Here in the foreground, we're just gonna lay in some dark values. Again, I'm being super messy, guys. I'm doing that thing where you just don't even care which direction you're your pencil goes in, just kind of creating some kind of messy, dirty shading. But since this is an object that is close to me, then it's going to appear more vivid, higher contrast, and so I'm putting in quite a bit of pressure. The one thing that I'm trying to do is to contain my shading inside of my boulder, just to try to kind of, so I'm kind of being messy, but it's kind of an intentional messy. And then this one is in the foreground too, so lots of pressure, and especially along the bottom and the left-hand side. Now, as I go to the background, as I go further toward my horizon line, my shading is going to get a lot lighter. So this big boulder that's way back here, I'm still going to shade it, but it's going to be very, very light, very little pressure. I'm using the same, in this case, 4B or 6B pencil, but very, very little pressure. So this can be very tricky for young artists. You have to kind of pretend like you're just floating your pencil over the paper. So all of these that are in the background, just barely touching the paper, giving them just a little bit of shading, and then as they come towards you, a little bit more pressure, because you're going to, atmospheric pressure or atmospheric perspective is going to let you see a little more value difference, as well as a little more texture and details in the object. There's one more thing that we're going to do to emphasize the sense of perspective, and that is to add a shadow that is being cast by each of our boulders. The boulders that are in the foreground are so big that where they land against the sandy beach, you wouldn't be able to see the shadows, so don't worry about those. In the middle ground, the shadow is going to be, all shadows are really horizontal. So they're gonna come out away from each of these boulders and kind of have like an oval type shape, kind of extended along the bottom. If the light source is up here on the right, then it's going to hit the object, and the object is going to cast this shadow, which is actually why it's called a cast shadow. So in the middle ground, we're going to have these nice cast shadows, and they're going to continue all coming out the same direction, all along the left side of the boulders. Long cast shadows. And then as they are closer to the viewer, you would see more depth, just because of the way that the sandy beach lays down. The further away from the viewer they are, then the lighter they are, and the more narrow they are. So we're just putting in a little sense of shadow. And that really helps to kind of nail our boulders down to the ground, gives them some visual weight. Great job, guys. That's your first lesson in perspective.